Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Dr. K's Psychobabble and part 3 in my exploration of the concept of intelligence. So in this particular episode, we're actually going to take a deep dive into IQ, a definition of intelligence based on testing and particular applications, probably the most commonly known measure of intelligence, but certainly not the only measure of intelligence, but certainly still pretty prominent in people's minds. So let's take a look specifically at IQ. Now, we left off the last time that we now understand from the work on the Stanford Binet intelligence test, we were able to see the construction of IQ as a relationship between the measured mental age of somebody and their corresponding chronological age. And if somebody was, in this example, if a person who has a chronological age of 5 performed like the average 2-year-old on the intelligence test, we would take that 2-year mental age divided by chronological age, multiply by 100, and we would get an IQ, in this case, of 40, a pretty low IQ. Now, it's important to remember at this point, remember the context in which the IQ had been represented. Even though Lewis Terman had gone in and they were applying IQ testing for the feeble-minded in order to achieve eugenic goals, the test still, it's at its heart and soul, goes back to the work of Binet as a test to determine whether or not individuals needed to have special services in school. I'm working on my slideshow here. Okay, so we're back to France. IQ is context specific, and what this means, in its origins, the IQ is specific to school and how well we'll do in school, and that's really the limitation of it. Now, I'm going to go into some of the cultural aspects, which is really the next video. We're going to look at IQ and culture, but to kind of generally set the stage for that particular conversation, context refers to the environment in which a person is acting, and we're using this test to determine how well that person will perform in a particular environment. Now, an individual in an environment based on sociological theory possesses a status and a role, and what this represents, the status of somebody is essentially their job title, and their role are the specific job duties associated with that particular status. Now, this isn't the sociology class, but all of us have multiple statuses, and all of us have multiple job descriptions or roles under each one of those statuses. The one we're looking at, the one that IQ relates to, is our status as a learner, and the role, what do learners do? What skill set do they have to learn things? And we start to really define, from a sociological point of view, what IQ is measuring. The capacity, the basic capacity for someone to learn things. Almost anything. People with high IQs are good at learning, so their skill set is very contextual to the actual school environment. This environment is defined culturally. So in this first context in France, the French curriculum and school system defined, that was the environment that defined the things they wanted students to be able to do if they were going to learn. So this is very specific to that particular environment. It's important to remember that in the rebuttal from Binet to Terman's application of his test for determining who was feeble-minded, he said that that was not a correct use of his test. He said the test is limited, and what he was referring to, even way back then, even though some of this conversation it rose later in the history of IQ testing, Binet knew right from the beginning that this was a test that was specific to students in the French school system, and you had to be careful about the kind of generalizations that you would make from an IQ test that was developed in France, and any application, even any application in schools in the United States, there had to be some limitations put into place. But nonetheless, we still have IQ itself defining how well, or predicting actually, how well the individual is suited to perform the role associated with their status in this particular environment, and it's in school. So I'm really driving home here the point that a person's IQ is not a definitive, all-encompassing, all-environment, all circumstances score that determines intelligence. It is specific to school. To that end, it is still a useful tool. We still want to be able to identify who needs special services, and that's really where the world of IQ rests today. So when we look at IQ in its context now, it is biased because it's specific to cultural places in which we're applying the test. It predicts how well people will do in school. It actually does a pretty darn good job of that, truth be told, because it's actually measuring the skill sets that somebody needs in order to be successful. And IQ helps schools make decisions as it was intended. Now, if you think about any sort of job that we might get, and let's say there's a test, let's say I want to be an auto mechanic. A great IQ test would be for me to identify the tools, identify procedures for particular mechanical failures, be able to diagnose particular mechanical failures. It's basically measuring the roles, the skill set that I need in order to perform the job of mechanic in an auto garage. So it's very specific to the skill set of a particular status and role. And the one we're talking about here is the kind of generic, a little bit more so than the mechanic example, but the generic role of learner in a school environment. So what the test does is it provides for a score, and lines have been drawn in the sand as to where are we going to have to pay special attention here. Now, what you have in front of you is a graphic that represents the distribution of scores, IQ scores, for the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WISC. Now, you can see that the average is 100, so we still have that sort of ratio thinking of, my mental age and chronological age being the same. So you get most people in the middle, and you see the distribution. If you look at that number 68, okay, people who take this test, 68% of them perform between 85 and 115, and that 34% below the 100, 34% above the 100. This is considered the average intelligence. Average normal intelligence on the WISC ranges from scores 85 to 115. And then you have some some more exceptions on each side. You have individuals between 85 and 70, about 13.5% there, and another 13.5% having scores ranging from 115 to 130. And these demarcations, this 34% and then an additional 13.5%, are based on a statistical figure that we refer to as the standard deviation. So without getting into the statistics of this, we have one standard deviation above or below the mean is considered the normal range. Two standard deviations above or below is really good or really challenging in terms of that person's ability to be in school. The line in the sand is more than 2 standard deviations above, or up to 3, 4 standard deviations. And you'll see from this graphic, you see that at the score of 130, those individuals, people with an IQ score of 130, less than 2% of the population falls into that category. And people with less than 70, 2% of the population falls in there. These lines now reside in social policy to define intellectual disability and giftedness, not genius. Genius is up to 150, 160, depending on what you're looking at. But intellectual disabilities, people will attain a diagnosis of intellectual disability if they have an IQ score of below 70. Individuals who have an IQ score above 130 will be designated as gifted. Schools want to know this information because the needs of individuals who meet the criteria for intellectual disability are different than the normal needs of students, and the needs of individuals who meet the criteria for gifted, 130 and above, they're different than the normal kids in the middle. These are the exceptions, 4% of the population, 2% on the bottom, 2% on the top. Now, so both of those populations actually, from a school point of view, are at risk. One, maybe they're just not getting enough support to be successful, and the other, they're bored. So each one of these groups is actually subject to behavioral challenges within the schools. Similar challenges for individuals on each end of that particular spectrum. It's important to recognize 2 things. First, this is function in school. This doesn't mean that individuals on either end of those are necessarily good or bad at other statuses that they have. I, for example, had a friend, very good friend of mine in school, who spent his entire high school career in the quote-unquote resource room. He scored very low on the IQ test. That individual went on to start his own business. He went on, he's very successful, married, family, kids, just had a grandchild. It was not, school wasn't his strong point. He did have intellectual disabilities when it came to school stuff, but they did not impact his abilities to do other sorts of things, and he certainly turned that around and made a successful life for himself on that. And certainly maybe many of us can think of extremely brilliant, book-smart individuals who may not have done as well once they were having to work with other people, or those skill sets that were there, but they're really good at school. They're the one you want, on Jeopardy. If you're on a team Jeopardy, that's the person you want on your team. Right? So these are important markings in the sand, and truthfully, these marks end up in policy. So if you look up the criteria to receive services in the state of Maine for intellectual or developmental disabilities, you're going to see that they need to have a score of 70 or below. Let me just throw this other thing out here, is we often hear within the school system of people with learning disabilities. Now, the peculiar characteristic of learning disabilities is this. We as psychologists really don't know a lot about how they operate. We may have fancy terms, we may have fancy ways of trying to understand. We may even have interventions that work based upon these theories, but we really don't understand the learning process really to that specific area. Let's say a person has trouble with words, like we have dyslexia or dyscalculia, a person who has chronic problems with mathematics and figures and whatnot, not quite understanding what's going on in the brain. But in order for someone to carry a diagnosis of a learning disability, get this, they have to have an IQ above 70. If a person has an IQ above 70, but yet they're performing below standard in a particular area, that is technically what we would call a learning disability. If the individual scored below 70, we would attribute that deficit in their skill to a general deficit in their intelligence. And again, we see the importance of that line in the sand of the number 70 to this day. We know the IQ is limited, but it is really useful in creating policy to be able to define what kinds of services people get. And now it's imperfect. There are people that score below 70 who do not need the services, and there's people that score above 70 that desperately need the services, and we certainly have advocates to try and help those individuals too so they don't fall through the crack. That's how we, that line, and people fall through that because they don't seem to sit on either one. That's where we get that terminology of people falling through the crack. And so we have, but these scores are very important. Now, because they're important, they don't just use any old tests. I mean, there's all kinds of IQ tests. If you look up IQ test, in fact, when I was doing research for this, it was actually hard for me to get by all of the free IQ tests in a web search to actually find the resources specific to clinically based IQ tests. The tests that you take online that measure your IQ are not standardized, they're not validated, they're fun. They're just meant as a curiosity, an intellectual stimulation, and a kind of a get to know yourself. No problem, just a great use of your time. I can think of much worse things you can do online than taking intelligence tests. It's to get to know you. How well did you do on that test? You don't want to make any generalizations about that other than this is how I performed on this test this day. However, when we're looking at making these critical decisions about what we do in school, we want to limit ourselves to standardized tests. These include the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, version 4, and its children version, WISC, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, WISC. And then this is really kind of cute. There's the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children revised, so it has the R, so they call it the Whisker. And so this is a company based on the work of Dr. Worcester, created an IQ test similar to this current and ever-present Stanford Binet. And there are other tests like the Cattell Intelligence Test. These kinds of tests are administered by individuals who have been certified. They're psychologists with a specialty in tests and measurements. And so when you're looking at a test such as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, this is actually the materials. You can see the scoring sheets, you can see the interpretive manuals, you can see the question and answer. This is an administered test. You sit down with a psychometrician, that's a psychologist that does testing, and they run you through the activities to create measures of your particular aptitudes and abilities and the kind of skills that you could apply to schools. Now, when those scores come out, unlike the Stanford Binet, and this is really what sort of separates the Wechsler from the Stanford Binet really still produces a score, and we need that. The Wechsler test produces a general score, but then tons of areas where we might look at. So you can actually use the Wechsler to help define specifically the areas where there may be learning disabilities. So the general score on the Wechsler may be above 70, let's say, but maybe some of the subscales are below, and therefore it helps you to identify areas where there might be learning disability, and then do the research in the literature as to what educators and psychologists have developed in terms of methodologies to teach and overcome those particular deficits. So if we took a look at the subscales within the actual Western, this is a graphic that presents all of the different scores and the different tests that are used to measure those particular capacities. So right there you see in the middle you have the full scale test. So you do get an IQ score, a general IQ score, but then we can start looking more specifically at the verbal area. And so there are core subtests, similarities, vocabulary, information, and then supplemental subtests. These are things that the psychometrician can add to the particular test in order to explore areas, and that's such as comprehension. Over here we have perceptual reasoning, where this is the core subjects are block design, matrix reasonings, visual puzzles. This has a lot to do with visual processing of information. Supplemental subtests include figure weights, picture completion, all of these sort of things that we would measure. Down here we have working memory. The core subtests are digit span, arithmetic calculations, and again, letter and number sequencing for supplemental subtests. And finally, processing speed. Core subtests include symbol search, coding, and then a supplemental subtest called cancellation. And you can see when somebody administers, these are not scores you get on your average online IQ test. These are tests very specific to the kind of basic mental skills that someone could then apply to the school environment. These are complex tests to learn how to administer. They actually offer courses to psychologists on how to administer these tests so that their administration methodology doesn't get in the way in the validity of the tests. Now, that given, these are specific tests were given by a psychometrician to determine particularly that line in the sand 70 when eligibility for services, disability determination, gifted and talented programs, plus stuff where there's kind of money involved. These are very important decisions to make, and usually they're left to those professionals. However, schools, particularly colleges and universities and they like to have tests that predict how well people will do in colleges and universities. And so there's always been a market for tests that would come along that measure intelligence, but it's specific to how well a person will do in college. So these tests exist, and you've heard of them. One of them is the infamous Scholastic Aptitude Test, or the SAT. The SAT is a test designed to predict how well a person will do in college. Another one is for graduate school, the Graduate Record Exam. Now, the GRE comes in a number of different ways. There's the general GRE, which is sort of a glorified SAT, and then many disciplines within the fields that are of study within colleges have GRE subtests. So when I went to graduate school for my doctorate, I had to take the GRE standard test, and I had to take the psychology subtest. So there was a whole test about what was my current knowledge about psychology as I was entering into the doctorate program. Now, interestingly enough, when I went for my first master's degree in counseling, the school, University of Southern Maine, gave me a choice. I could do the Graduate Record Exam, or I could do the Miller's Analogies test, the MAT, which again was a predictor of how well people would do in graduate school. Now, the Miller's Analogies test is a test where the entire test is figuring out relationships between words, and that this has been correlated with success in graduate school. So someone might say, oh, I'm going to make one up here, but it's, light bulb is to lamp as chicken is to, and it gives you 4 things. By understanding the relationship between a light bulb in a lamp, like the light bulb goes into the lamp, the chicken goes into the oven. And that might be one of the four choices. So you have to guess that. By understanding the relationship between the first two, you're able to select the correct term that also signifies the same relationship between the second two. And they're not as easy as a light bulb and a lamp. So that was a way to each one of these tests, however, keeping in mind these tests predict the likelihood, the statistical likelihood that someone will do well in school. There's all kinds of factors that come along after the fact that get in the way of individuals being successful in school, or there's all kinds of factors such as tutoring and just motivation and whatnot that make someone who may have not tested well perform exceptionally well in college or school. So this is not the end of the game. It's just a useful tool for some of the initial conversations that we would have of people who are going to go to school. Now, that said, can't have a discussion about IQ without really talking about the concept of genius. Now, genius, although depending on where you look it up and who you talk to or whatever, genius will be defined, certainly scores above 130. But other organizations and what will have even other tests will say, no, you're not a genius until you're like 150 or, and there's, of course, the highest ever IQ test, ever measured and whatnot. Those exist. But nonetheless, we're looking, what is the extreme? They're really, really high. And we have this term that says genius, a little bit different than the term gifted, but a person who's a genius who has exceptional intelligence. And in general, the most common criteria is actually akin to gifted, which is 130 and above. And one of the organizations that is important in defining that term genius is Mensa International. Mensa is an international organization of individuals who score 130 or above on an IQ test. Now, they have their own IQ test. Just for curiosity, if you go up and you look on their website and you just look up Mensa, M-E-N-S-A, and go to Mensa International, and they have all the guidelines for joining and practice tests, and they set up a testing opportunity for you. I'd imagine it probably costs some money. And you go and take that test. You take their IQ test. You don't show up with your Wechsler test. You take their test, they administer their test, and if you score 130 and above, you can be invited to join this group. And the group has It's obviously exclusive. It has its roots in Great Britain, of the intelligentsia getting together, and they just want very intelligent people part of this club. It's sort of expanded all over the world. Different nations have Mensa organizations with them, all the way down to different states here in the United States having Mensa organizations. And it's kind of, if you look at it today, it's sort of almost like a social networking opportunity specifically for individuals who have high IQs. And so if that's something that's attractive to you, then certainly go ahead and explore that as a way of connecting with other people with your very high intellectual abilities. I personally went and took the practice test and I bombed it. So that was very discouraging. And it's not in my wheelhouse to go become a Mensa member, I don't think. So here what we did today is kind of taking a deep dive into this concept of IQ, although it has some really, it has very concrete origins in the work in France. It came over the United States. It continues that role today, even though it took a little side trip down the old eugenics road. IQ is still important today. The tests continue to be developed. However, considerable debate started to come out about IQ tests application within schools, particularly when schools became racially integrated. And what happened is the cultural bias of tests, of IQ tests, as they had been written, primarily by white affluent men, the actual bias in the tests began to reveal itself as it fairly inaccurately began to predict test scores for people of color. And so when we stacked those individuals together and we had individuals of color performing below their white peers at that time, the immediate assumption was that people of color were inferior, but the problem really, and this was statistically shown, the problem was really in the design of the test. So how do we design a test that takes into consideration the varied cultural backgrounds of individual when those individuals are being assessed for basic level skills? We're not talking about job hunting, where you're looking at the person who's best at something just that way. The IQ test, in terms of going into a school system, really have to have that ability to measure core abilities of those individuals in order to be their most fair. So the next video is going to focus on IQ again, but in the context of culture. So we'll take a look at that next time. Look forward to seeing you. Be sure to subscribe to this channel, and I will see you folks later.